most students, I decided to go through a series on the topic called coordination and response. I will also look at past questions at once I'm done with this series. So we'll try and see how far we could go in trying to simplify this concept. So based on the syllabus content for coordination and response, we are meant to describe a nerve impulse as an electrical signal that passes along nerves called neurons. So this is quite simple, doesn't need any further explanation. So a nerve impulse is an electrical signal, that passes along nerve cell called neurons. We should be able to describe the human nervous system in terms of central nervous system, and we'll also look at the peripheral nervous system and coordination and regulation of the body functions. So we'll also look at types of neurons. We'll look at how to describe a simple reflex action, describe a reflex action, and also the function of synapses and how it is able to transport impulse across two neurons. Now, you can define the synapse as a junction between two neurons. That's all. Comes out in the exam usually as 2 mark question, but it's quite straightforward. So, without wasting so much time, we also look at the effect of drugs on the synapse, and also example heroin, and also the reflex action. So quickly, let's look at it. Um, First, what is sensitivity? This has to do with the ability to recognize and respond to changes in the external and internal environment or conditions within which an organism finds itself. So you find out that a change in condition is usually called a stimulus. So whether it being hot, change in temperature, change in pressure, is called a stimulus. Now, for a coordinated response to occur, there must be what is known as a receptor organs, which recognize the stimulus, and effector, which is a mechanism to carry out a response. So having this basic idea about how the system works in order to coordinate itself, first there must be a stimulus and also a response to it. So quickly, you see the human nervous system. There are two systems involving coordination and response. There are two systems involving coordination and response in humans. This is called the nervous, it includes the nervous system and the hormonal or endocrine system. Now, the nervous system, it includes the brain and spinal cord. These two forms the central nervous system. Then the peripheral nerves and specially sense organs such as the eyes and the ears. Now, this is a diagram of a dissected brain and the spinal cord and section of the nerves. Now, this is the brain. You see how it's connected to the spinal cord, and you now have sections of nerve cells. Now, the nervous system. The human nervous system is made up of two parts, like I said earlier. The central nervous system, CNS, central nervous system, that is made up of the brain, and also we have the spinal cord. And their major role is for coordination. While we also have the peripheral nervous system, which consists of nerve cells, and they help to connect the body to the CNS. So the function of the peripheral nervous system is simply to connect the whole part of the body to the central nervous system. That means it connects the whole part of the body to the brain and spinal cord. Together, they coordinate and regulate body functions, and sense organs are linked to the peripheral nervous system. These are group of receptor cells responding to specific stimulus, and these stimulus include light, sound, touch, temperature, and chemicals. Now, when exposed to a stimulus, they generate what is known as an electrical impulse, which passes along the peripheral nerves to the central nervous system. Thereby, it will trigger a particular response. So, we need to look at the structure of the nerve cells known as neurons. And neurons are made from unspecialized cells called stem cells. Please take note of this. Neurons are made from unspecialized cells called stem cells. Now, there are three types of neuron. We have the sensory neuron, we have the relay neuron, and we also have the motor neuron. Now, if you look at the syllabus content, you are only meant to be able to recognize these different type of neurons from diagram. Nobody's going to ask you to draw it. It's just for you to recognize it and know some certain features that will be able to differentiate one neuron from the other. Now, the basic thing you need to know is between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron, you look at the position of the cell body. Here, the cell body is towards the end of the neuron, while here the cell body is at the start of the neuron. Now, you find out that all these neurons have what is known as a myelin sheath, and also they have axons. Axons terminals. Now, it's where the electrical impulse passes through, and the myelin sheath only a major function is to make sure the impulse travels in one direction so that there won't be any form of leak outside this terminal. Now, you should look at this like an electric wire that enable in the transport of normal electricity. Inside, you find out that you have the naked wire itself, and that help in the movement of electric current. And outside it, you might have um, a rubber tied around it to reduce shock. Now you find out that or leak of the current outside that particular terminal. Now this myelin shift acts like it helps to make sure it travels in one direction, and also that there won't be any form of leak outside the uh, the terminal, the axon terminal. Now, this is the nerve also have synaptic endings, which we'll look at the synapse shortly, and these are the receptors. So in this case, the skin here is the receptor organs, and it receives, let's say, temperature. Then we on the skin you now have these sensory nerve cells that will now carry out this impulse, the electrical impulse round the body. It will now send it to the motor to relay, from relay to the motor neuron. So we'll look at that subsequently. So quickly, these types of neurons, the three types of neurons, sensory neurons, also known as afferent, carry impulses to relay of the brain, and they link the sense organs to the central nervous system. And the relay neuron, also known as interneuron or connector, because it connects the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, interprets impulses. While motor neuron, efferent or effector, carry impulses to muscle cells and connect the central nervous system to an effector organ. In example, the muscles. Now, if you look at this diagram, you can also look at the direction of movement of impulse. First, the dendrite on this sensory neuron detect the stimuli and it get transported. Now, you remember the difference between this sensory neuron and motor neuron is that the axon in this case is at towards the end. The cell body is towards the end of the neuron. Now it carries the impulses and send the impulse into the relay neuron, which is also known as interneuronal connector, because it connects both the sensory and motor neuron. Now from there, inside the relay neuron, the impulse gets interpreted and sent out through the motor neuron to effector organs. Now, in the motor neuron and the interneuron, you find out that the cell body is at the start of the neuron. So, quickly, that will now move us into synapses. Now, is the junction between two neurons is known as a synapse. The junction between two neurons is known as a synapse. Now, if you look at this, you find out that this is one neuron bringing a response, and let's say this is let's call this, since this is bringing it in, this should be the sensory neuron. Now, the sensory neuron is connected to relay neuron R, and the relay neuron is connected to the motor neuron, which will now send it to an effector. Now, what you find out here is each of these neurons have a point of contact. So this point where the sensory neuron has contact with the relay neuron, it forms a gap here, which is a junction. that separate the two neurons, and that is called the synapse. Now, if you magnify the diagram, it looks exactly like what we have here. Now, it has what is known as the synaptic cleft or gap. It can also be called the gap. In the exam, if you can't remember the word cleft, please remember the word gap. Is the synaptic gap, and it also have vesicles containing what is known as neurotransmitters. So these dots inside here are called the neurotransmitters, which are found inside the vesicles. Now, this is the presynaptic neuron. So this will now be the cell membrane of the presynaptic neuron, and this will also be the cell membrane of the postsynaptic neuron that have what is known as receptor cells that have complementary shape to this neurotransmitter. So we'll look at this shortly. Now, structure of the synapse. Now, this is exactly a past exam question where the structure of a synapse was given and you were meant to identify the part and also their function. Now, I need you to look at it like a normal cell, like a cell in a plant. I'm sorry, uh, animal cell. So, if you have an animal cell like this and you are not asked to identify the part, obviously you know that E here is the mitochondria, and the major function of mitochondria, it helps in, is the energy power, or is the power of the cell that enable the process of aerobic respiration, which is a chemical reaction that react with nutrients in the presence of oxygen to release energy. Though so it's a component of a cell that releases energy during aerobic respiration. But F here, as we looked at in the previous slide, is they are pointing towards this dot. So you find out that F is this and is called a vesicle. And from this diagram, you find out that the vesicle have the ability to move down to the presynaptic cell membrane. So the major function is for movement. You should know that it helps to transport electrical impulse, help to transport neurotransmitters. So it helps in the aid of transport. I've seen a question too on cells where they ask what is used for transport. So usually it's the vesicles. You see it as small holes and inside the cell cytoplasm. Now, next we have G, the neurotransmitters, and the major function is they help to transmit signals from one neurons to the next neurons. Then H is actually the gap between the two neurons. Okay, H is also a neurotransmitter. Then the synapse itself, okay, is J because it's not pointing to anything. This is actually pointing to these two dots here. So J is the synapse, which is the gap between these two neurons. Then you have K, the receptors, which are the molecules that the neurotransmitters will definitely bind to. Then M, where is M? Okay, good. M is actually the nucleus of a cell, which controls cell activity. Now, so having known this, let's move to how impulse pass from neuron to neuron. Please take note of this because it comes out as a 5, 6, and the least I've seen it is a 4-mark question. So how do impulse get transported from one neuron to the next through the synapse? Now, first, these are the steps here. If you could remember the steps, it will just give you your 6 marks. Now we have one. If you look at this, let me change the color of this pen to there's no green here, green. So if you look at this, you find out that this is impulse arriving, the presynaptic neuron. So this is the presynaptic neuron that brings in the impulse. Now, an impulse arrives at the end of a presynaptic neuron. That's the first stage. Then two, what will now happen in number 2 here is vesicles move towards and fuse with the presynaptic membrane. So these vesicles will now move down and fuse with this presynaptic membrane here. Fuse with the presynaptic membrane. This releases neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. Now it will release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft or synaptic gap. Now the neurotransmitters diffuse across the synaptic cleft or gap down the concentration gradient from a region of high concentration, which is the presynaptic neuron, to a region of low concentration, which is the postsynaptic neuron. So it diffuses across it. That's three, the third part. And the fourth is neurotransmitters attached to the receptors on the postsynaptic neurons. So here, number four, they attach to receptors on the postsynaptic neurons. Now, the reason is because they have complementary shape. Remember that. It will give you an extra mark. It's the neurotransmitters have complementary shape to the receptor molecules, so it will bind to it. And once that is done, it moves us to number five. The fifth point is this triggers an impulse which travel along the postsynaptic neuron. Simple. It triggers an impulse. Now you see the impulse that was coming here is now here. It triggers an impulse that will now travel along the postsynaptic neuron. Now, the neurotransmitters are recycled or destroyed once an impulse is sent. So, recycle or destroy once an impulse is sent. This is all you need to know for this to get that full mark. Now, effect of drugs on the synapse. This also come out a lot. Effect of drugs on the synapse. First, we have heroin. Let's say example heroin though in the max scheme. So heroin is usually converted to morphine, and heroin have the ability to also diffuse across the synapse. And once it diffuses, it binds to receptors. It binds to receptors, and heroin have complementary shape also to receptors, just like neurotransmitters. So it blocks neurotransmitters from entering the receptor site or stimulate a receptor. So this reduce sometimes increase pain perception as appropriate, and morphine stimulate the release of dopamine, which acts on the relay neuron even when no impulse is in the neuron. So you should take note about this. Drugs have a complementary shape to receptors, so they bind to receptors, and as a result, they will now block neurotransmitters from binding to receptors, and therefore these have an effect of either it reduce or increase pain perception. Now, how do synapse ensure one-way direction of impulse? It's simple. Neurotransmitters are released on one side of the synapse, and receptors are found on the opposite side of the synapse. I've seen that as a two-mark question. That's why I included it in this section. Now, reflex action. You should know that a reflex action is a rapid automatic response. It's a rapid automatic response that helps us to survive. It is an involuntary action as it does not pass through the brain. It's an involuntary action and it does not pass through the brain. It is controlled by the spinal cord. Example are coughing, pupil reflex, nail jerk, and swallowing. The pathway that impulse travel along during a reflex action is called a reflex arc. So learn that definition quickly. You can pause it and jot it down. The pathway that impulses travel along during a reflex is known as the reflex arc. Example of a reflex action is touching a hot object or standing on a pin. So let's look at it, how it happens. And because in an exam, I've seen questions where they expect you to identify the sensory, relay, and motor neuron. And also, I've seen questions where they will ask you to draw an arrow to show the direction of movement of the impulse. Now, first, you have your sensory neurons here. You should be able to identify them because the cell body is found towards the end of the neuron. Now, so the first thing is receptors from the skin were detected in case of, if possibly, in this case, we are looking at hot plate. And the sensory neuron will now convert it to electrical impulse, which will now be traveled down to the synapse here to the gray matter in the relay neuron. Now, in the relay neuron, remember earlier we said the impulse will now be interpreted, and this is found inside the spinal cord. You see why the brain is not responsible here. In the spinal cord, from there, it will now send out the impulse through the motor neuron, And you can identify the motor neuron because the cell body is found at the beginning of the cell. Now, the motor neuron, which is an effector, we now send this impulse to the effector muscles. In this case, we look at the biceps and triceps, which will now jerk off, or in order for you to remove your hand from the hot plate. So a reflex action is an automatic response to a stimulus. Yes, a reflex act describes the pathway of an electrical impulse in response to stimulus. So it describes the pathway of an electrical impulse in response to a stimulus. While we have relay neurons are found in the spinal cord. Take note, connecting sensory to motor neurons. Now, this is just a further explanation of what I just described. And the same thing here in the case of a nail jack. You see here, sensory neurons carries it into the spinal cord. The relay neuron interprets it and also sends some of the signal to the brain, if possible. And the motor neuron now send information to your muscle cells, which is an effector that will now cause a nail jar. Now, this is just more like a simple animated diagram to explain the whole process. So first, we have receptors. From receptors, sensory neurons. From sensory neurons, it moves to the relay neuron, which is in the gray matter of the spinal cord. From there to the motor neuron, and from motor neuron to effector, which will now cause the hand to contract or relax. So describe the reflex arc. So receptors, a cell or an organ that receives the stimulus and convert it into electrical impulse. And sensory neurons carry the impulse from the receptor to the central nervous system. Now, don't get yourself confused here. Remember, the central nervous system is either the brain or spinal cord. So in this case, it's majorly controlled by the spinal cord. Now, the relay neuron carries impulses slowly across the spinal cord. No myelin shift in the relay neuron. No myelin shift. Now, it allows time for response to be more modified by any impulse. Then the motor neuron carry impulse from the central nervous system, in this case, the spinal cord, to an effector. Effector, the structure that carries out the response and can be muscles or glands. Now, effector, in this case, you need to know your antagonistic pairs right from key stage 3. Once the impulse arrives, in the case of the arm, you have your bicep and tricep, and the movement of one affect the other. If the bicep contract, tricep will relax, and if tricep relax, bicep will contract to enable the movement of the arms in response to stimulus. So thank you for this part.